Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep with these horror stories that we've titled The Scariest Day of My Life. So before we start, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave a comment. When you're ready, make yourself comfortable and relax. Before I tell you about my experience, I must warn you that if you are too sensitive and cannot tolerate topics related to violence and blood, it is better if you skip this story, because what I am about to tell you is not only not suitable for everyone, but it is absolutely true, and it happened to me more than 10 years ago. It was another scorching hot day in New Mexico, and the sun was beating down on the cracked streets. I was walking home after a very tiring night shift, thinking about how to get everyone to leave me alone and get some rest. But suddenly I saw a guy in a UN-like uniform a few meters ahead. "You're under arrest," he said in a firm voice. Before I could ask what was going on, a woman stood next to him and smiled, but in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't have time to ask questions or question anything, because they took me by the arms and pushed me into a black van with tinted windows. "Don't resist, or you'll be in trouble," said the woman with an unnatural smile. "You may want to scream, but that won't help." My stomach knotted in terror as I looked around, frantically asking these people where they were taking me, but they said nothing. At that point, I was sure they weren't UN officials. They never acted this way. My heart was pounding like a runaway horse as I watched the landscape blur by as the vehicle sped through the desert, until we finally stopped outside a lonely hut in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, they both got out, and the woman grabbed me by the hair and dragged me out of the back seat. My stomach turned as they pushed me inside an old ramshackle cabin in the middle of nowhere. As I entered, the stench hit me hard. The air smelled of blood, sweat, and something metallic and putrid that made me feel sick from the very first second. It was truly nauseating. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the place, it became clear that I was not in a normal cabin, and my heart sank. The walls were covered with instruments I did not want to see, chains, whips, and tools that seemed to be taken from a nightmare. I recognized all these things as instruments of torture, and at that moment my heart froze. In the center of the small room, there was a chair. But it wasn't just any chair, it was more like a throne for a deranged person, the kind we usually see in horror movies where there are asylums and things like that. I can't even describe the level of terror I felt when I saw all that. Imagine for a moment everything that went through my mind, but even so, that wasn't even close to the nightmare I was about to experience. "Welcome, I'm David," said the man with a twisted smile. "And this is Cindy," he said, pointing to the girl next to him, who was smiling as if she were enjoying a show. "You're going to be a great addition to my collection," she added, pure evil reflected in her eyes. But before I could do anything, Cindy pushed me towards the chair. The leather straps bit into my arms and legs as David turned on a tape recorder, and his emotionally empty voice filled the room. "If you are listening to this, it means that you are mine now. You should know that you will experience unimaginable pain, and that no one will hear your screams. You will be here until I decide to get rid of you," he said with satisfaction. In that moment, I learned the true meaning of the word terror. I struggled against the straps, but they were too strong, and I begged to be released. I assured them that I wouldn't say anything about what had happened if they let me go, but it was in vain. David came over laughing as he picked up a scalpel from the table. Tears began to fall from my eyes without me being able to help it. I had no idea what he would do to me, but I knew it wouldn't be good. With a smile on his lips, he began to draw a line across my arm with the edge of the scalpel. At first, it wasn't a deep cut, so it burned more than it hurt. But he made it deeper as he went along, and with every moment the pain increased until I could hardly contain my screams. The pain was indescribable, and it felt like an eternity. When he finally stopped and put the scalpel back on the table, I looked at my arms and could see the huge open wound and the blood gushing out of it. However, David was far from finished. Suddenly, he lit a small stove that was on the table, and my heart sank to my stomach when I saw him take out a kind of iron stamp, like the one they used to brand cattle, and put it on the stove. "Please, no," I said in a plea. But he didn't even listen to me. He seemed fascinated by what he was doing. "Wonderful. That's just the kind of mark I was looking for," he exclaimed as he pressed the hot iron hard against my thigh. I have to say that this is the most excruciating pain I have ever felt in my life. I have never experienced more heart-rending pain than this. The horrible sensation of my skin being burned and that indescribable smell of roasted flesh will never be erased from my mind. "You're a beautiful canvas," he whispered, as if enjoying the show, as the intense smell of burning flesh mingled with my screams of agony. "It's time for a makeover," said Cindy, approaching with a mocking laugh as my body trembled uncontrollably with pain and fear. Then David grabbed me by the hair and threw me backwards, tearing the skin on my head. I could feel the blood running as he cut great tufts of my hair and my scalp. Blood ran down my face, and when I realized it, he was cutting deeper furrows in my head. It was like a bloodbath, and they were doing it just for fun. For hours, or maybe days, I don't know anymore. They experimented with every method of inflicting pain they could think of, while my body went back and forth between lucidity and unconsciousness. I passed out several times, and when I woke up, they made sure to make me feel the most chilling pain they could, bringing me to the point of begging God not to let me wake up the next time. They not only tortured me physically but also psychologically, forcing me to look at a mirror in which I could barely recognize myself. "You are nothing," David whispered to me. "Just another piece in my game." I wanted to die. I prayed for it all to end. But a part of me refused to give up. I thought of my family, especially my mother, who must be completely desperate not knowing about me, in the midst of so much despair. At one point, Cindy made a mistake and inadvertently left the keys to my chains within reach. When I realized this, my survival instinct kicked in despite how weak and in pain I was. They left the cabin, and I could hear the sound of the truck driving away. This is my chance, I thought as I took the keys with trembling hands, and even though they almost fell out, I finally managed to free myself, and I quickly got to my feet and ran away. On a couple of occasions I felt like I was going to pass out. My wounds were bleeding like hell, and I had lost a lot of blood. Only the adrenaline and my determination to survive kept me going. I don't know how long I ran for, but in the end I could see a small trailer park in the distance, and I headed straight for it. The sun was blinding me, and Cindy's words and David's voice were still ringing in my ears, causing panic to take hold of me. But I didn't stop. I ran to the nearest house and knocked on the door until someone opened it. It was an old woman, who made a face of terror and brought both hands to her chest when she saw me. For a moment I thought she was going to faint or something worse, and her mere gesture was a confirmation of the terrible state I was in. The old woman called the police, and they arrived shortly after, making the same face of horror as the old woman when she saw me. Finally, I received medical help, and after several surgeries and a lot of treatment, my health was restored and my appearance has improved significantly. But the scars I carry inside are still fresh. David and Cindy were arrested, and their reign of terror came to an end. This sick couple is now behind bars and awaiting their moment on death row. As you can imagine, I was not their first victim, but I was the only one who managed to escape their sadistic game with their lives. The officers found several shallow graves around the cabin and managed to rescue the bodies of 3 other women who had disappeared in the area several months earlier. I'm glad to know that justice was done, but even though I managed to escape that hell, all the horror I experienced there will never leave my mind. Sometimes I still hear David's mocking voice, and I look at the faces of the women who were never as lucky as I was. Their silent screams have been etched in my mind forever. How many others had suffered like me, I will never know, but I know that the echo of those days of horror still lingers, and forgetting is not an option for me. I'm 20 now, but this story begins when I was 11. I was a child, you know? Innocent, trusting, and completely oblivious to the problems of adults. All I cared about then were my friends, video games, and my favorite soccer team's games. But everything changed radically when my father asked my mother for a divorce. That was the beginning of a horrible experience that marked my life forever. My name is Scott, and this is what happened. It was the summer of 2016. My parents had just divorced and everything in my life seemed to be upside down. My dad had moved to another city, and my mom, well, she was acting strange. I mean, most of the time she acted as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was normal and she felt great. But I knew it wasn't quite like that. I would often come home from school and notice that her eyes were very red and more swollen than normal, as was her nose, which showed that she had been crying for a long time. But whenever I asked her, she would tell me that everything was fine and that she just had a bit of an allergy. And then she would start acting as if she were super happy and doing things with more energy than normal. However, sometimes she would spend hours in silence with that lost look in her eyes, something I didn't understand at the time, so I didn't think anything of it. As for my father, since he moved in with his new girlfriend, I hardly saw him. He only paid my maintenance and called me from time to time. Likewise, our relationship was never the closest in the world. I was always closer to my mother, since he worked long hours and I almost always saw him alone at night. One day, my mother told me we were going to London to visit my grandmother. "It'll be a fun trip, Scott. We need a break," she said with a smile that now, looking back, I know was forced. I was excited. We hadn't been to London for years, and the idea of seeing my grandmother, who always spoiled me, made me very happy. Besides, anything was better than staying at home, watching my mom cry silently in front of the TV off and then pretending nothing was wrong. The trip was normal. My mom didn't talk much and she was a bit pensive, but that didn't seem strange to me. I thought she was just tired. When we arrived at my grandmother's house, everything seemed the same as always. The smell of freshly baked cookies, the old photos on the walls, and my grandmother in her ever-present flowery apron that was so pretty. She gave me a big hug as soon as I walked in, as if she hadn't seen me in ages, and gave me a big kiss on the forehead. "My darling boy, I finally see you again," she said, with that sweet voice that always calmed me down. "Guess what I have for you? A pile of vanilla biscuits, your favorite," she said with a huge smile, and that filled me with emotion. Grandma's biscuits are the best in the world. The first few days were quiet. My mom seemed more relaxed and spent a lot of time chatting with Grandma and doing things in the kitchen. We also went out for walks, we ate together, and in the evenings we watched old movies on the sofa. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't identify. Sometimes I saw her very happy, smiling and lively, and other times I caught her looking out of the window, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. However, one night everything changed. It was July 15th, I remember, because it was my dad's birthday. That night we went out to dinner at an Italian restaurant that my mom loved. The last time we were there was to celebrate my father's birthday about 3 years ago, and I couldn't help but make the comment. At that moment there was silence, but then my mother smiled and changed the subject, saying that it was time to order dessert, but something in her expression had changed. When we got back from the restaurant, my grandmother suggested a comedy movie night, and I couldn't agree more. I loved comedy movies, especially the old ones, as I have always had a great fascination for silent films. We had a good time laughing out loud with the Three Stooges, and when the movie ended, my grandmother went up to her room and I, who wasn't sleepy, stayed on the sofa playing with my tablet. My mother went into the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. I also saw her take a packet of cigarettes out of her pajama pocket, which I found strange, since she had quit smoking years ago. She left the kitchen and told me she was going to go up to the roof to get some air, which wasn't unusual since she loved to do that. Even at home, she liked to go up to the roof when she needed to relax. "I'll be right back, Scott," she said, stroking my hair. I nodded, distracted by my video game, and told her I'd wait up for her to come to bed, but she didn't reply and went upstairs. However, the minutes passed and she didn't come down. I started to feel a little uneasy. I was already getting sleepy and I told her I would wait for her. "Mom," I called, but there was no answer, so I went upstairs, and when I opened the door to the roof, the wind hit me in the face, but there she was, standing on the edge and looking into the void. "Mom!" I shouted, scared, trying to tell her it was dangerous, but she didn't turn around. She just said, in a voice that didn't sound like her, "I'm sorry, Scott, I can't take it anymore." And without giving me time to do anything, she just jumped. I can't describe what I felt at that moment. It was as if the world had stopped, as if the sky had fallen on me. My screams were so loud that they woke up the whole neighborhood as I ran towards the edge with my heart in my throat. But it was too late. I ran so fast that I almost fell into the void myself when I tried to stop. But the worst was yet to come. When I reached the edge of the roof, I looked down, and what I saw is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life, and the most painful too. Mother's body was lying on one side of my grandmother's rose bush, in a strange position and with a pool of blood forming around her. That terrifying image was tattooed on my mind, so much so that I remember everything in detail, and every now and then I relive that moment in my nightmares. I was paralyzed, unable to move, to breathe, to think. My grandmother came running, and when she saw me, she knew immediately what had happened. She was speechless for a moment, and then she ran towards me crying uncontrollably and hugged me tightly. "My God, Scott, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry," she kept repeating over and over again. But I couldn't feel anything, just a huge void as if someone had ripped my heart out. The following days were a blur. The police, the neighbors, the psychologists. Everyone was talking, but I wasn't listening. I didn't want to. My mom was dead, and I couldn't understand why. Why had she left me? Why didn't she tell me how she felt? Why didn't she ask me for help? Now, 9 years later, I still ask myself those questions. I have learned to live with the pain, but it never completely disappears. My grandmother raised me after that, and I will be eternally grateful to her. She was my rock, my refuge in the middle of the storm. But there is something I can never forgive. The fact that my mom didn't give me the chance to save her. Sometimes I dream about that night. I wake up in a sweat with her voice in my head. "I'm sorry, Scott." And although I know now that she didn't mean to hurt me, I can't help feeling angry. Angry at what she did, at what she did to us. But I also know that she was suffering. Depression is a silent and treacherous disease, and although I can't change what happened, I can try to understand it, for her and for me. So here I am, telling my story. Maybe it's not a story about ghosts or apparitions, but believe me, it is terrifying to witness something like what I had to see that night. Nothing is more terrifying for a child than losing his mother, and even worse that way. This is not for you to feel sorry for me, but for you to understand that pain is not always visible, and that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who suffer in silence. And if anyone reading this feels like my mom, please speak up. Ask for help. Don't give up. It was just another Tuesday, nothing special about it. I had worked longer than usual and just wanted to get home, make a quick meal, and go to bed. When I opened the door, I noticed that the house was silent, which was normal, as Diego, my partner, was on his night shift at the hospital. So I left my backpack in a corner and went to the kitchen. And while I was waiting for my food to heat up, I heard a creak coming from the bedroom. I stopped the microwave and listened for a moment. Maybe it was the wind or something, but the truth is that a feeling of unease crept over me. So I decided to go up to my room to make sure everything was okay. When I opened the door, I was frozen. There was someone in my bed, in the shadows. The male figure there was wearing a white t-shirt and gray boxers, and the sheets were messy with clothes strewn everywhere. I didn't recognize him, but it took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. Diego wasn't there. So who was this guy? Sorry, I muttered, and the man stirred a little as if he were just waking up, and when he turned his head towards me, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were empty, but there was something disturbing about his gaze. He sat up, leaning on his elbows, and at that moment my heart began to beat very fast. What the hell was going on? The first thing I thought of was calling the police, so I turned to do so, but the man hardly seemed to notice what was happening. The guy rubbed his eyes, as if all this were normal, and finally broke the silence. I don't want any trouble, I'm just a little tired, he said in such a neutral tone that it totally baffled me. That calm disarmed me. This was no typical thief. This guy didn't fit into any category I could understand. At that moment, I could feel panic rising in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I slowly backed out into the corridor without losing sight of the stranger, and while I searched for my phone in my back pocket, I warned him, "I'm going to call the police, you'd better leave right now." Honestly, I didn't know if that would scare him or make him angry, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. Hearing what I said, the man got out of bed. He was taller than I imagined, but he also looked quite thin, almost like a specter. He raised his hands, trying to show that he wasn't a threat, and took a step towards me. "I really don't want to hurt you. I'm just looking for someone to sleep with," he said slowly, almost as if he were trying to calm a frightened animal. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for someone to answer 911, while he slowly approached, with calculated movements. In that moment, I felt trapped between the need to stay calm and the growing sense of danger that made me want to run. "I'm serious. I don't want any trouble," he repeated, and his voice grew tenser with each word, although he still didn't sound alarming. But there was something strange about him. His tone sounded harmless, but there was definitely something very threatening about the way he was acting. I was in the middle of the 911 call when the operator's voice brought me back to the present. 911, what is your emergency? Just at that moment, the guy jumped towards me with beastly agility, and I felt him take the phone out of my hands and smash it on the floor. My first instinct was to scream, but his hand closed tightly over my mouth, preventing me from making a sound. "Shut up, don't scream, because if you do, there will be no choice," he said in a tone that made me tremble. I didn't need to delve deeper into what he was saying, so I nodded quickly, trying to show him that I understood. His fingers trembled on my face, and he seemed as scared as I was. Finally, he let go of me and took a step back, and then I noticed that he was breathing heavily. After a moment, he pointed to the bed. "You're going to lie down there with me, I just want to sleep for a while," he said in a higher tone that made my hair stand on end. I shook my head, but he took another step towards me and warned me. "Do it!" he shouted angrily, and my body reacted before I could think. Without realizing it, I approached the bed, ready to do as he asked. I had no choice. He lay down on his left side first and gestured for me to join him. Trembling, I lay on my back with every muscle in my body rigid. As soon as I was settled, he came up behind me, dragging his arms around me tightly. I could feel his panting breath on my neck, and it made me even more nervous. "Stay still, don't make me do anything I don't want to," he said close to my ear, and it sent shivers down my spine. His voice sounded as if it were about to break. It wasn't a direct threat, but the weight of his words kept me paralyzed. His embrace held me tightly, and every time I tried to move, he tightened his grip. So I closed my eyes very tightly, trying not to let the tears escape. I didn't want to show him how scared I was. Suddenly, I felt something cold near my neck, and my breathing stopped. It wasn't his hands, it was his teeth. He had them pressed against my skin as if he were about to bite me. And although he didn't move either. It was as if he were toying with my fear. At that moment, I panicked. I couldn't go on like this, so without thinking, I threw one elbow back as hard as I could and hit him in the ribs. The man let out a groan of pain, and I took advantage of that moment to roll out of bed, running towards the door at full speed. But when I was just a few steps away, I felt a pull on my hair, and I fell backwards onto the floor. The pain was intense, and the fear was 1,000 times worse. As I turned to look at him, I noticed that his expression was no longer the same as before. It was almost inhuman. His eyes were unfocused and full of rage, and his face said that he was about to attack me. I didn't know what to do. In the blink of an eye, he grabbed me by the hair and threw me hard against the wall. The blow left me dazed, and before I could react, I saw him raise one leg, pointing it straight at my head. I closed my eyes, preparing for the impact, but suddenly a shot rang out in the room. I opened my eyes and saw him freeze. His hands went up, and the fear on his face was as intense as mine. When I turned my head, I saw two policemen at the door pointing their guns at him. One shouted an order, and at that moment, the guy let out a heart-rending scream before falling to the floor and covering his head. The officers handcuffed him while he repeated over and over again, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I just wanted to sleep." The man's voice cracked with tears, but his eyes were still in another world. They dragged him out of the room while I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. An officer picked up my phone and gave it back to me. The call was still active, so the officer had heard everything and had sent help immediately. Later, I found out that the guy had escaped from a mental health institution that same afternoon. He wasn't a criminal, they said. The man had been admitted for violent behavior and hallucinations, although that didn't make what had happened to me any less terrifying. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep in my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, the weight of his arms and his teeth on my neck. Diego tried to help me, but for several days I had to sleep far away from him every night. My nightmares were horrible, and in them the stranger was always by my side, and when I would wake up with a start and see a man next to me, I would hit him and cry in despair. I didn't know when I would be able to sleep in peace again, or if I would ever recover from this horror. However, after a period of receiving therapy to heal my trauma, I finally managed to gradually overcome that situation. But at one point it became so chronic that it almost cost me my relationship with Diego. Life in our small town in Michigan used to be simple. We were those kids who spent our time playing video games at school and fooling around at home. It wasn't the perfect house, but my grandmother always made everything feel cozy. However, one morning she argued with my mom and went to her village without even saying goodbye, and that changed everything. That night at dinner, my mom was sitting at the head of the table, meticulously, almost obsessively carving her steak. I was sitting across from her, trying to ignore the tension in the air, but it was impossible. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, but her eyes seemed lost in nothingness, as if she were looking through me. "Yes, dear, I'm just going to visit a friend tonight," she replied in a voice that sounded hollow, almost robotic. I watched as she brought a fork full of meat to her mouth, and something in her gaze chilled me to the bone. She didn't seem like my mother. At least, not the one I knew. She'd been acting strange the last few days. She seemed more irritable than usual, and she was constantly arguing with Grandma, and I assumed that was why she eventually decided to leave. I couldn't stand her anymore. The following days were a nightmare. My mom started behaving more and more strangely. Sometimes she would hum old songs while cleaning the house, but suddenly, for no apparent reason, she would start banging on the drawers furiously. "Why are you blocking the garage?" I asked her one afternoon, trying to keep my cool. "Raccoons," he replied without looking at me. "There are raccoons outside. I don't want them to come in. Those damn raccoons are a nightmare." I had never seen a raccoon near the house, so I didn't understand why they bothered him so much now. But I decided not to argue. Something in the way he looked at me made me feel it was best not to ask anymore. One night I was startled awake by a creak in the hallway. The sound of heavy, slow footsteps echoed in the darkness, and that alarmed me. If my grandmother was at home, it was just my mom and I, as my dad had abandoned us when I was very young. So in a way, I was now the man of the house. So, with my heart pounding, I opened the door to my room just enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow in front of the garage door. It was my mom. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle and her hands were clenched tightly on the doorknob as if she were trying to get in somewhere else. "Mom," I whispered nervously, but there was no answer. Suddenly she turned her head towards me and her eyes opened wide, shining in the darkness, and then she smiled, a smile that made my blood run cold. "Go back to bed, dear," she said in a voice that was soft but not sweet, rather eerie. I couldn't sleep that night. The following days were even more disturbing. An unbearable smell began to permeate the house, a horrendous stench like a dead animal, and it seemed to come from the garage, which made me think of the raccoons Mom was talking about. Maybe one had tried to get in and gotten trapped in the garage. But when I mentioned it to my mom, she told me it was just a plumbing problem. I insisted we should take a look, but then she gave me an irritated look and threatened to punish me if I didn't go to my room right away. Considering how volatile her temper had become in recent weeks, I didn't want to challenge her, so I just did as she asked and went back to my room. The next morning I had to cover my nose with my sweatshirt to be able to be in the house. The smell was so pungent it was unbearable. That night I woke up around 1 in the morning and went down to get some water, but when I got to the kitchen I found her. Mom was holding a butcher's knife in her hands and her face was illuminated by the light from the refrigerator in a way that left me paralyzed. "Mom?" I asked, feeling my breath catch in my throat. She slowly turned her head and her eyes seemed emptier than ever, almost as if there was a shadow behind them. "I was thirsty," she said in a low, guttural voice that didn't seem human. I couldn't bear it any longer. I knew something was up with her, and whatever it was, I had a hunch I'd find the answer in the garage. So that night, after she'd gone to her room, I decided to open the garage. I was so nervous my hands were shaking, but I was determined to find out what was going on, so I grabbed the key I kept in a secret place and unlocked the door. As I opened the door, a wave of stench hit me hard, making me step back and almost vomit instantly. The light flickered, revealing shadows cast on old tools on the walls. But what shocked me most was what I saw in the corner, a crumpled tarp that was covered in something dark that had spilled onto the concrete floor. The smell was so nauseating that I had to take off my t-shirt and tie it around my face to be able to get closer. With the knot in my stomach, I pulled hard on the canvas, but what I discovered underneath it took my breath away. It was my grandmother's body. I recognized her immediately by her daisy dress. Her body was swollen, covered in bruises, and with her limbs in unnatural positions. Her skin was a gray color. Her empty eyes stared into nothingness, and her mouth was half open in a horrible grimace. I fell back, stumbling and hearing a thud, and I had to cover my mouth with both hands so as not to scream at the top of my lungs. My legs gave way, and my body trembled with the horror and panic I felt. Suddenly, I heard my mother's footsteps coming down the stairs, and I didn't have time to think, so I covered the body as best I could and ran to the main bathroom. There I locked myself in, and with trembling hands I dialed 911. "What is your emergency?" asked the operator. "Please hurry, my mother. She killed my grandmother. Her body is in the garage," I muttered, and hung up just as I heard her footsteps approaching the bathroom door. "Josh, are you in there?" I didn't reply. She knocked a second time, but I didn't answer either. Then I heard her walk away humming a ridiculous tune as she pressed me against the bathroom door, trying to make me invisible. I heard my mother approach the garage door. She stopped there for a few seconds and then started walking back. Her steps grew heavier and she stopped just outside the bathroom. "Josh?" she asked again, this time in a soft and stealthy, almost threatening voice. "I know you're in there, sweetheart," she said in the same tone, and my heart was pounding in my chest. Suddenly she started to turn the doorknob, which made me feel a knot in my stomach. I was sure that if she managed to open that door, the next corpse in the garage would be me. But at that moment, police sirens began to be heard in the street, and the scene that followed was chaos. The officers stormed into the house, and I saw my mother being dragged out of the house, screaming like a wild animal as her messy hair flew through the air. "Why did you do this?" she asked with her eyes fixed on mine, with such intense hatred that my blood ran cold. "Because you're a monster," I shouted at her, feeling the world crumble around me. That was the last time I spoke to my mother. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. The worst part was that when the police arrived, she was standing in front of the bathroom door, brandishing the same knife she had used to murder my grandmother. And she had no qualms about confessing that she intended to kill me too. After that, I was looked after by an aunt until I came of age. The first thing I did when I became independent was to sell the house and move away from that city. I didn't want to have anything that reminded me of my mother and that horrible episode in my life. My name is Franklin, and like many of you, at some point in my life I found myself in a terrifying situation. It all happened on a night that seemed normal, until chaos broke out. It was just another day, and after a long day at work, I came home feeling exhausted and wanting something nice to eat. I had decided to defrost a couple of empanadas and put on my favorite TV show to relax. My house was in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and there was that feeling of security that sometimes makes us let our guard down. It was approximately 10 at night when I heard a strange noise outside. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a little uneasy. It's not that I wasn't used to noises at night, but this one sounded different, more disturbing, like a familiar creak, but one that didn't fit with the usual calm. Cautiously, I got up and went to the window, trying to look out, but darkness was taking over, and the only light filtering through was from a distant street lamp. I looked down the empty street but saw nothing, at which point I assumed it was just my mind playing tricks. Perhaps the tiredness had affected me. So I decided to let it go and went to bed, thinking it would be wiser to ignore it. However, in the silence of the night, the noises began to intensify, and this time I couldn't ignore them. Silent footsteps echoed down the hallway, and suddenly, fear paralyzed me. My heart began to beat faster. Suddenly, the door opened slowly, and there were 3 shadowy figures. They weren't ghosts or creatures from another world. They were men of flesh and blood. And I knew it instantly when I noticed the way they moved. Cautiously, and with that dangerous intent that only criminals possess. Like a survival instinct, I decided to hide in the closet. I was sure they wouldn't be interested in searching such an obvious place. Even though I knew there was nothing of value there, fear drove me to hide. Meanwhile, the 3 of them began to search my things, looking for something worthwhile. I felt the cold of a knife in my pocket, but I wasn't willing to risk it. There were 3 of them, and only 1 of me. And although it wasn't just a question of numbers, they could also be armed. "Are you sure it's here?" One of them, who seemed to be the leader, blurted out. "I've been watching him. He hasn't taken anything. He left everything at home." It was clear to me that they were looking for the money. A few days ago, I had withdrawn a large sum from the bank, money that I had saved after selling my house. A feeling of panic began to take hold of me as I realized that one of them had been following me, spying on my movements with the intention of robbing me. Suddenly, one of them raised his voice in celebration. They had found what they were looking for. My heart sank as I heard their laughter, that laughter that was pure evil. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them putting my money in a large bag. The beam of light from a flashlight illuminated my hiding place for an instant, and my heart stopped. I took a shaky breath, hoping they wouldn't discover me. A second later, the beam of light passed by, and for a moment I felt I might have a chance. I was there, surrounded by danger, feeling completely vulnerable. However, I swore to myself that if I got out of this, I would never again underestimate the meaning of insecurity, nor let blind confidence drag me into another situation like this one. As the criminals continued to rummage through my things, a mixture of fear and determination took hold of me. I was ready to fight for my life, even if it meant confronting them if they ever got that close to me. The thieves continued to search my house for valuables. Time felt eternal. Every second that passed hidden in that closet increased my chances of getting out of this nightmare. Then the sound of a fight gave me away. A guy approached the closet. My heart was beating wildly and I felt like my destiny was hanging by a thread. Suddenly, he opened the door of the cupboard and shone his torch in my face. In a moment of madness, I took out the knife I had in my pocket and held it tightly. The thief was surprised and took a step back. He didn't have an elaborate plan or anything, he was just thinking about surviving. The atmosphere was full of tension and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. I looked the thief in the eye, and at that moment I knew that I wouldn't hesitate to use the knife if necessary. He was a young guy and he seemed a bit scared. His two friends were downstairs, completely unaware that I was in the house. Without saying a word, the thief ran out. I could still hear him shouting at his friends, warning them that I was there and that I had seen his face. I quickly left the closet and taking a look at the room, I started thinking, where could I escape to? My thoughts were racing, and to my horror, the three of them were back and not saying anything. The men began to block the door of the room in total darkness, knives in hand. They surrounded me slowly, ready to attack. At that point, I had to do the only thing left to me. I turned around and jumped out the window. The fall was a bit hard, but not fatal. My body was burning with pain and I realized that I might have broken my arm, but the really crucial thing was that I was still alive. From the ground, I noticed that none of the three thieves had come down after me. They all stood looking at me from above with palpable rage, or how mad they were for having thrown me. I thought for a moment about those who I thought would come after me, but that never happened. It seemed that they had really been scared and they just ran away. With one arm that I could barely move, I hobbled to a neighbor's house and asked them to call the police. Inside, the officers searched my entire house, but found no trace of the thieves or my money. Luckily for me, however, all was not lost. What those criminals didn't know was that my house had surveillance cameras, so while I was talking to the police, we checked the recording and could see how they tried to get in when no one was looking. Exactly when it all started. Finally, they managed to arrest the three men and my money turned up. To be honest, I needed that money as I was planning to move a little closer to my family. But beyond that, I was relieved to have survived that terrifying encounter. I remember that tense look with the most inexperienced thief, and it made me realize how fragile life can be. Now, what I hope is that this experience serves as a lesson for everyone. You don't need monsters or ghosts to live a horror story. Sometimes it's the most everyday situations that can happen to anyone that turn out to be the darkest. I just want you to keep calm and make the best decision you can if you ever find yourself in a situation like that. In the end, what matters is being alive. It was a quiet night. My wife and I had just bought 2 hectares of land in a small town in Nevada. We had always dreamed of living in the countryside, so when we saw that the property was incredibly cheap and that it also had a cornfield, we thought it was the perfect opportunity. However, if I had known what was coming, I would probably have thrown those property documents in the trash on the spot. When we arrived, the place was just as we imagined it. The cabin looked super nice and was surrounded by that cornfield that seemed to touch the sky. My wife went out to the house with our dog Bruno while I started to take the boxes out of the car. But suddenly Bruno went crazy, barking as if he had seen a ghost, and ran straight to the back of the property. Juana called to him, and between her concern for the dog and the suitcases, I followed her. But before we knew it, I heard a heart-rending scream from my wife. My heart stopped for a second. I dropped everything and ran towards her. When I arrived, I found her with her hand on her chest, breathing heavily, but Bruno, on the other hand, seemed calmer. "What's wrong?" I asked him, worried. "Oh, nothing, I just got scared by a scarecrow," he replied. This was when I noticed the strange things. Those scarecrows were the most terrifying and disturbing I had ever seen. But as the shock was already in the air, we decided not to make a big deal of it and went into the cabin. That night, as we were trying to arrange our things, we suddenly heard some banging on the door, but we weren't expecting visitors, not even jokingly. I went to open the door, and there was a strange-looking old man. His clothes were tattered, and he had an inverted cross hanging around his neck. The man stared at me as if he were assessing me. "Can I help you?" I asked, a little uncomfortable. "No, you can't help me, but I can help you," he replied, almost in a whisper, as he took my hand and placed the cross on my palm. He was surprisingly strong for his age, and I felt very strange in that situation, so I tried to withdraw my hand. "Hey, take that off me," I said, annoyed. "There's no time to lose, son. The harvest is about to arrive. Hang the cross on your door or face the consequences, trust me," he warned with a voice laden with dark meaning. And just as I was about to ask what was going on, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the night. It was an unsettling experience, but I didn't feel like dwelling on it, so I just slammed the door shut. "Who was it?" asked Juana as she saw me return. "Just a weird old man, nothing to worry about, darling," I said, and looking at the cross, I decided to get rid of it, so I threw it into the fireplace without thinking. At midnight, about midnight, a strange sound woke me up. It was as if a bell was ringing. My head still heavy with sleep, I went downstairs to investigate and realized that the noise was coming from a grandfather clock in the living room, a clock that I hadn't even noticed until that night. But the strangest thing was that, upon closer inspection, I discovered that there was a hidden door behind it, and it was chained shut. I didn't know what it all meant, but my intuition told me that things in this place were about to become much more disturbing than I had imagined. What secrets did this property hide? As I approached the clock, something in the window caught my attention. I couldn't believe it. The scarecrows were no longer on their poles. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Before, they were impossible to ignore, but now, not a single one was in sight. It was too weird. I thought maybe it was the glass of wine I had before going to sleep. So I turned around and stumbled up the stairs, sure my mind was playing tricks on me. For 3 nights in a row, I noticed the same thing. The scarecrows disappeared at night and returned at dawn. This was strange. I thought the village idiot's jokes were more insidious than I thought. But everything changed when Bruno, our dog, disappeared. Searching all over the property, I finally found his body. A horrible sight full of worms lying at the foot of one of those scarecrows in the cornfield. Blood was scattered over the stalks, and nearby there was a knife soaked in red. I didn't know how I was going to tell Juana what had happened. Just then, I ran into the creepy old man again. "Did you hang the cross like I asked?" he asked, and I replied without thinking, "No, I burned it." The expression on his face changed drastically. "That is the fate of your ancestors. Get ready. The harvest begins after 11. Before I could ask him anything else, the old man disappeared again, and I began to feel that madness was just a step away from me. At midnight, a metallic noise woke me up again, but this time it was accompanied by chaos coming from the field. I looked out of the window and a chill ran down my spine. It was terrifying. My knees were shaking. The scarecrows were alive. Each one had a rudimentary agricultural tool, but they didn't seem to be there to plant anything. Their intentions were more than suspicious. I grabbed my wife and ran downstairs, but before we could escape through the front door, we realized we were surrounded. The scarecrows were trying to force their way in. My only option was the dark door I had discovered behind the clock. Mysteriously, it was now open. We didn't hesitate and rushed towards it, but as soon as we entered, the door slammed shut. Inside, the tension was palpable. The walls were covered with dark parchments and strange relics, disturbing ornaments, and a pile of books that spoke of a curse and an ancient ritual called the harvest. All of this seemed to indicate that if we had placed the cross on the door frame as the old man had told us, perhaps we would have been spared this nightmare. But because of my stubbornness, our fate would now be the same as those who had gone before us, those who were already decomposing or had turned to ashes inside that sinister room. My head was about to explode. I couldn't understand how we had come to this. God knew what awaited us if we didn't find a way out right then. Horror was taking hold of us. Every second felt like an eternity in the darkness. Before panic could consume us, Juana began to look through the books, and her eyes lit up with an idea. Wait, it talks about a counterspell here, she said, her voice trembling, but with renewed determination. If we can perform the ritual mentioned here before midnight, we could break the curse. We quickly set about searching for the necessary items in that mysterious room. We found candles, dried herbs, and a small bowl that seemed to be part of the ritual. As I searched, I felt a chill when I heard the sound of scarecrows banging furiously on the door. They knew we were trapped. "Come on, we have to hurry," I shouted at Juana, as we began to assemble the improvised altar with what we had found. With the clock ticking away every second that passed, Juana recited the words of the ritual while I found the courage to light the candles. The atmosphere changed. A heavy air came between us and the chaos outside. Suddenly, the scarecrows began to howl in a kind of collective scream that resonated through the space. The walls trembled, the parchments rustled, and for a moment I thought everything would fall apart. But there, in the midst of the noise, Juana forcefully summoned the last line of the spell. In that instant, a bright light exploded on the altar, illuminating the entire room and filling the air with an electric vibration. A strong wind came out of nowhere, opening the hidden door with a deafening roar. We looked at each other with disbelief and hope. "Run!" I shouted, and together we rushed towards the exit, leaving behind the dark secret of that place. When we crossed the door, the field welcomed us, but the scarecrows had disappeared. In their place, the corn waved gently in the moonlight, as if it had regained its peace. We fell onto the cool earth, laughing through our tears and with our hearts beating 1,000 miles an hour. "We did it. We did it," Juana repeated, hugging me tightly. We looked at the cabin, which now seemed like a refuge rather than a prison. But in that moment of relief, I remembered something crucial. "Will the cross work to protect us now?" Juana looked at me. "What cross?" she asked. "The one the old man gave me," I replied. Without thinking, I searched among the fireplace, and after a while, we found the cross that I had thrown away. "Maybe this still has a meaning," I said, and decided to go and hang it on the doorframe, feeling a wave of calm. With dawn breaking on the horizon, the little town of Nevada was beginning to wake up. We looked out over the field, where a new crop was being sown, full of possibilities and colors.